Listen carefully to this. An awards ceremony built on dignity, moral clarity, and reverence for legacy did not end with applause. It ended with confusion, with visible distress, with a sound that was never meant to be heard on that stage. Because when Meghan Markle stepped forward at the 2026 MLK Junior Beloved Community Awards, something went wrong. Not loudly at first, not in a way producers could immediately control, but wrong enough that, within seconds, the room shifted. And once it shifted, there was no pulling it back. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to start with. How does a night dedicated to unity produce a moment of public rejection? And more unsettling still, why did it happen then? In that room, at that event, to that person? This is not a story about a single outburst. It's not about one crowd, one reaction, or one speech. It's about a fracture that's been forming quietly for years, finally surfacing in real time, in front of cameras that couldn't quite look away fast enough. What happened at the 2026 MLK Junior Beloved Community Awards matters not because of who was booed, but because of where it happened and what that audience represents. This was not a hostile venue. This was not a political rally or an internet comment section given physical form. This was a carefully curated audience. Community leaders, donors, civil rights advocates, institutional partners, people who understand decorum, people who understand restraint, which makes what followed all the more jarring. At first, the sound was ambiguous. A low rumble, the kind of noise that, in a large room, can be mistaken for applause echoing off walls. Even seasoned producers hesitated. Was it clapping? Was it shuffling? Was it nothing? Then faces began to change. Not dramatically. Not in a way that screamed disruption, but subtly. A tightening of jaws, eyes dropping, a few heads turning, not toward the stage, but toward each other, toward exits, toward the floor. And on stage, Meghan Markle noticed. You can see it if you watch closely. Not in the broadcast edit most people saw, but in the raw feeds, the clips that surfaced later, the angles no one expected to escape. Her posture shifts. Her breathing changes. There's a pause that lasts just a second too long. And then, unmistakably, tears. That moment, those seconds, would become the image everyone argued about. Some called it cruelty. Others called it consequence. Many didn't know what to call it at all. But here's the problem. Focusing only on that moment misses the story entirely. Because nothing about what happened that night was sudden. It only appeared that way. To understand why the reaction was so strong, you have to understand what this event is supposed to be. The MLK Junior Beloved Community Awards are not celebrity showcases. They're not red carpet spectacles. They exist to honor service, sacrifice, and alignment with a specific moral philosophy, one rooted in humility, collective struggle, and community-first leadership. Which raises a difficult question. What happens when public perception decides that alignment no longer exists? That's the tension running beneath everything we're about to unpack. For years, Meghan Markle has occupied a complicated cultural space. To some, she represents progress, courage, and resistance against entrenched systems. To others, she embodies something else entirely. Celebrity activism untethered from accountability, symbolism over substance, presence without proximity to the communities invoked. Those competing narratives have lived side by side for a long time. Online, in opinion columns, in whispered conversations at donor dinners and board meetings. But they had never collided like this. Not in public, not in a room like that. And certainly not with the weight of Dr. King's legacy hanging over every word spoken from that stage. The official explanation released afterward was measured, carefully worded, emphasizing dignity, context, misinterpretation, statements about a small portion of the audience, and heightened emotions. But explanations like that only work when people believe they're hearing the whole truth. And many didn't. Because within hours, alternative footage began circulating. Audio enhanced, angles stitched together, eyewitnesses speaking anonymously. Some saying the reaction was louder than reported. Others saying the boos were not spontaneous, that there had been visible tension in the room long before Meghan Markle ever reached the podium. That's when the narrative cracked open. Why were some attendees visibly uncomfortable before she spoke? Why did producers cut away so quickly? Why did applause tracks swell precisely when crowd noise dipped? And why, perhaps most importantly, did the room fail to recover? Because in events like this, recovery is expected. Awkward moments happen. Emotions flare. But institutions are designed to absorb discomfort and move forward. This one didn't. Instead, the atmosphere thickened. Speeches that followed felt rushed. Energy drained. Smiles tightened. The night limped toward its conclusion rather than soaring. And backstage, according to multiple accounts, there was panic. Not outrage. Panic. The kind that comes from realizing something carefully controlled has slipped beyond reach. It's tempting to reduce this to a single explanation. To say this was about race, or politics, or celebrity fatigue, or media manipulation. But stories that simple rarely survive scrutiny. This one doesn't. Because the reaction in that room wasn't unified. Some attendees did applaud. Some looked horrified by the boos. Others stayed frozen, caught between social expectation and personal discomfort. That split is important. It suggests something deeper than hostility. Something closer to a reckoning. Ask yourself this. When an audience that understands symbolism rejects a symbol, what are they really rejecting? The person? Or what they believe that person represents now? And here's where the timing matters. This didn't happen in 2018, or 2020, or even 2022, when cultural tensions were at their peak and public sympathy was still high. It happened in 2026, after years of shifting priorities, growing skepticism, and a noticeable change in how institutions and audiences respond to celebrity-led moral narratives. People are listening differently now, watching differently, measuring credibility in ways they didn't before. And institutions feel that pressure, which brings us to the selection itself. Because one of the quietest controversies surrounding the event emerged not from the audience, but from within the organization. There were reportedly internal debates about the choice of honorees. Concerns raised, questions asked, some resolved, others, allegedly, set aside in favor of optics, partnerships, and broader strategic goals. None of that was visible on stage, but it may have been felt. And when you combine that with an audience already primed with mixed expectations, even a single misjudged moment can trigger something larger. That's the part no one wants to admit. Moments like this don't erupt out of nowhere. They arrive when tension has nowhere left to go. As the footage replayed across social media, reactions polarized almost immediately. Supporters framed the moment as cruelty, proof of intolerance, evidence that Meghan Markle remains unfairly targeted no matter the context. Critics framed it as overdue accountability, a sign that public patience had finally run out. But both sides missed something crucial. Neither explanation fully accounts for why this happened there, at that event, on that night. Because if the reaction were simply about personal dislike, it wouldn't have carried the weight it did. It wouldn't have rattled organizers. It wouldn't have produced such carefully managed silence afterward. Silence, in this case, is telling. Several prominent figures expected to comment didn't. Organizations that usually respond within hours waited days. Some statements were drafted and never released. Others were issued with language so neutral it bordered on evasive. When institutions hesitate like that, it's rarely because they don't know what happened. It's because they know exactly how complicated it is. And complication is the enemy of clean narratives. That's why this story refuses to stay contained. Why it keeps resurfacing. Why even now, months later, people involved still speak in fragments, half sentences, and off-the-record caveats. There is a shared understanding that something shifted that night, not just for Meghan Markle, but for how legacy platforms, celebrity voices, and public trust intersect going forward. And that's the thread we're going to follow. Not to assign blame, not to offer easy verdicts, but to understand how a moment designed to honor unity instead exposed fracture, and why that fracture had been forming long before anyone heard a single boo. Because the sound that echoed through that room didn't begin there. It began earlier, much earlier. And as we're about to see, the first signs weren't audible at all. They were written, quietly. In emails, planning meetings, and decisions most people never knew existed. And once you see those, the moment on stage looks very different. Before the microphones even captured it, there were signs. Subtle, almost imperceptible. An undercurrent in the planning meetings that went unremarked or perhaps ignored. Organizers spoke in polite tones about audience readiness and message alignment, phrases that sounded neutral but, in hindsight, were warnings. There were mentions of potential optics concerns, discussions about whether certain lines in the speech could be misinterpreted. Nothing alarming on the surface, but in reality, the tension was already building, quietly, beneath the ceremonial veneer. And then there was the invitation itself. Extending an honor to someone like Meghan Markle was not a trivial decision. It required coordination with her team, careful framing for the audience, and, according to multiple sources, debate within the awards committee itself. Some felt it was overdue recognition, an acknowledgement of her advocacy and visibility. Others were skeptical. Was she the right person to embody the values of the beloved community? Did her public persona align with the history and the mission of the awards? Internal emails show phrases like may provoke unintended reactions and audience may be split, hints of hesitation that were never meant for public eyes. They were signals, perhaps ignored at the time, that would later echo loudly in that room. So by the time she walked on stage, it wasn't an empty room. It was a room layered with expectation, curiosity, and subtle judgment. People were watching, not just the person in front of them, but the history that she was stepping into. And history has a way of making its presence felt, especially in spaces dedicated to legacy. The moment she approached the podium, the atmosphere was already charged, though the cameras didn't catch it. There were glances exchanged in the audience, subtle but telling. Not everyone was on the same page. Not everyone was prepared to celebrate. And in that quiet tension, something shifted. A cough, a murmur, a shifting of chairs. The kind of noise that can be easily dismissed, but that sets a stage for something larger. Something that cannot be undone once it begins. Her first words were deliberate, careful, polished lines, honed for effect, for resonance, for impact. And yet, despite preparation, there's a human element that no script can control. The audience responds, not to words alone, but to energy, presence, the combination of voice, gesture, and aura. And in that combination, the audience found moments that clashed with their expectations. Not outright hostility, but dissonance, discomfort. And discomfort can be contagious. In a room where everyone is attuned to signals, it spreads quickly. By the time the first audible reactions emerged, there was a tangible shift. It started as murmurs, a collective inhale, a subtle rise in pitch, almost imperceptible on broadcast. But in a live setting, it was undeniable. And those seconds stretched, long enough for a performer, no matter how experienced, to sense something amiss. The subtle change in energy was registered, and when she realized it, her body responded. Shoulders stiffened, pauses lengthened, eyes darted, and then, finally, the tears, small, hesitant, unplanned, but undeniable. An emotional rupture that the stage was never meant to contain. The visual impact alone is striking. But what's often overlooked in commentary is the psychology of that moment. It's one thing to experience audience disapproval from a distance, reading comments, or hearing filtered feedback. It's another to feel it in real time, in a room designed for respect, where every reaction is amplified by expectation and historical weight. It is intimate, immediate, unavoidable. And in that intimacy, the story becomes more than a headline. It becomes a study in human perception, group dynamics, and the fragile nature of public persona. The reaction itself, what people saw, what they heard, was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, there was chaos. Organizers moved quietly but urgently, ensuring cameras stayed on the most controlled angles. Staff members whispered into headsets. Notes passed in the wings. Quick decisions were made about how to proceed, how to salvage the evening without further exposure. Each choice was a calculated attempt to maintain composure while the room's energy diverged from the intended narrative. And that divergence would not only be captured by some cameras, it would be amplified by others. Phones, private recordings, leaked footage. Within hours, it was no longer just a room. It was the world. And yet, even as these logistical elements unfolded, the human element remained central. How does one reconcile emotion with performance? Visibility with vulnerability? Presence with expectation? These are not questions that have easy answers. They are the kind of questions that linger long after the stage is cleared, long after the microphones are off, long after the initial news cycle fades. They are the questions that keep institutions awake at night, that shape internal debates about recognition, legitimacy, and the meaning of public honor. Which brings us back to the audience itself. This was a group carefully selected, curated, and historically engaged with the mission of the awards. They are not a faceless crowd. They are decision-makers, influencers, and stewards of legacy. That makes the reaction more complex than simple disapproval. It makes it a reflection, intentional or not, of collective judgment. And collective judgment is heavy. It carries weight not only for the recipient, but for the institution that organizes the event, for the legacy that the event seeks to honor, and for the broader public who watches, interprets, and debates from afar. So we return to the fundamental tension. A moment meant to celebrate unity instead exposed fracture. And the fracture was not obvious to everyone at first. It required attention to nuance, to gesture, to timing, to the way sound travels in a room, to the human capacity to sense, instantly, when a story has veered from its intended path. And in that awareness lies both the tragedy and the fascination of what happened.